I was attached to the 109th Cadian Reconnaissance Regiment 3 days before Van's Reach vanished from Imperial records. At the time, none of us believed the world worthy of deeper notice. It was an agriplanet orbiting a dim red dwarf at the edge of the Morocco Belt, valuable only for its nutrient exports, and immense pine forests that stretched across entire continents like dark oceans of needles and bark. The planet possessed no strategic significance, no sacred relics, and no known history of rebellion. By every standard metric issued by the Administratum, it was forgettable. That fact alone should have warned us. The first distress signal reached the frigate Saint Ossuary during fourth cycle prayer observance. I remember the astropath collapsing before the transmission fully translated. Blood streamed from her blind eyes while she repeated the same phrase in a voice that did not belong to her. The trees have no shadows. No one understood the meaning then. The bridge officers assumed environmental corruption or localized warp interference. The message itself was fragmented beyond coherence. Entire sections of Vox data had been stretched into elongated bursts of static resembling distant screaming. Yet buried beneath the distortion were enough military identifiers to force inquisitorial review. Patrols were disappearing within Forestry Sector 82. Entire logging camps had ceased communication. Orbital augers registered unexplained thermal absences beneath the northern canopy where millions of trees should have radiated residual heat. I was ordered planetside within the hour. The descent through Van's Reach's atmosphere remains vivid in my memory because the storm clouds moved incorrectly. I do not mean against the wind, I mean they folded inward, collapsing toward invisible centers like flesh tightening around wounds. Even the veteran Navy pilot guiding our Valkyrie stopped reciting his litany of safe passage midway through descent. Below us spread endless forests stained, crimson beneath the dying sun. Rivers cut through the wilderness like black veins. Smoke rose from distant refinery towers. Everything appeared ordinary until we crossed the northern sectors. Then the shadows disappeared. The pine forests below us reflected the red sunlight clearly across their upper canopies, yet nothing darkened the ground beneath them. Thousands upon thousands of trees stood above pale soil untouched by shadow. It looked wrong in a way my mind struggled to process. Human vision expects darkness beneath objects. Without it, the forests appeared detached from reality itself, like unfinished picked projections layered across the planet. The pilot whispered a prayer to the throne. Our landing zone had once served as logging bastion Theta, though the surviving personnel simply called it Outpost Grey. Cadian troopers manned the perimeter walls alongside exhausted labor militia carrying autoguns with shaking hands. The moment I stepped from the Valkyrie, I noticed the silence. No birds, no insects, no movement beyond the wind dragging through the razor wire barricades. Even the generators sounded muffled, as though the forest absorbed noise before it traveled far. Colonel Vare met me beside the gate. His uniform hung loose from lack of sleep, and his right hand trembled continuously around the grip of his chainsword. "Your order, Malleus?" he asked. I showed my rosette. He looked relieved for less than a second. Then he leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Interrogator, we buried 37 men yesterday. This morning their graves were empty. Inside the compound, conditions had already deteriorated beyond standard military panic. Guardsmen avoided looking toward the tree line. Servitors repeatedly froze mid-task while facing north. One Mechanicus adept sat against a Vox relay, tower carving identical vertical lines into his own metal limbs with a plasma scalpel. Every few minutes someone claimed to glimpse movement beyond the forest, though no auspex detected life. I began interviewing the survivors immediately. Most accounts contradicted each other in detail, yet aligned in emotional tone. Patrols vanished after entering the northern woods. Vox systems failed without warning. Men became separated from squads despite marching only meters apart. Several troopers described hearing footsteps pacing beside them for hours while nothing appeared on motion scanners. Others reported brief sightings of something tall between the trees. None could describe its signed face. Every witness stumbled when attempting to explain that part. One trooper simply began vomiting blood whenever questioned. Near dusk, a salvage team returned from an abandoned logging camp 12 kilometers north of the bastion. They discovered the workers gathered inside the mess hall exactly where they had apparently died. No signs of combat existed. No wounds, no toxins. The corpses sat upright around the tables with their hands folded calmly in their laps. Every body was missing its eyes. The salvage team found the eyes stacked carefully in spirals across the floor. That night the temperature dropped below freezing despite the humid summer air. Frost spread across the interior bunker walls in branching white patterns resembling thin skeletal fingers. At approximately second watch, perimeter alarms activated simultaneously across the eastern barricades. Cadian heavy weapon teams rushed to defensive positions while searchlights swept the forest. At first we saw nothing. Then one of the troopers began screaming. He pointed toward the trees beyond the wire where 8 trunks stood clustered together in unnatural symmetry. Something impossibly tall moved slowly between them. I remember only fragments clearly. Blackness hanging like funeral cloth. Limbs too long for any human anatomy. A pale shape where a face should have existed. The searchlights burst apart instantly. Darkness swallowed the barricades. And from somewhere beyond the trees came the sound of footsteps approaching through the frost. No one fired. Discipline collapsed beneath pure instinctive terror. Veterans who had survived orc sieges backed away from the barricades, whispering broken litanies through chattering teeth. The footsteps continued at a measured pace through the frost, never quickening, never slowing. Then the Vox Tower crackled alive without power. A childlike voice emerged across every speaker, stretched thin by static. He is still ascending. Immediately afterward, every lumen inside Outpost Grey extinguished simultaneously. Beyond the silent forest, the darkness lasted only 17 seconds according to the chronometers recovered later from Outpost Grey. To those of us trapped behind the barricades, it felt immeasurably longer. Men shouted prayers into the void while frost crept across the gun emplacements in branching white veins. I remember hearing the footsteps continue beyond the wire, even after the lights failed. Slow, measured, patient. Then, just as abruptly as the blackout began, the emergency generators reignited and drowned the compound in harsh red lumen glow. Nothing stood beyond the barricades. The trees remained motionless beneath the bleeding dawnlight. Yet every trooper stationed along the eastern perimeter had abandoned their firing positions. One young guardsman repeatedly slammed his forehead against the ferrocrete wall while screaming that he could still hear breathing behind him. Colonel Vare ordered immediate lockdown procedures. No personnel entered or exited the compound without my authorization. Double sentries were placed on every tower. Mechanicus adepts sanctified the Vox arrays with Binharik. Ward chants that crackled through the morning air like static electricity. Fear had already rooted itself too deeply. At first light the missing patrol returned. 7 soldiers emerged from the northern road through drifting fog. Their uniforms hung in tatters and their skin carried the grey pallor of corpses left too long in winter ground. The sentries nearly opened fire until the survivors raised their hands peacefully and continued walking toward the gates with slow mechanical precision. Each step landed at exactly the same moment despite uneven terrain. Not one looked toward the walls or reacted to shouted commands. Their heads remained tilted slightly downward as though listening to distant whispers beneath the earth. When the gates opened, the truth became visible. None of them possessed mouths. Smooth flesh stretched from nose to jawline without scar tissue or blood. The skin looked pale and seamless like cooled wax molded over bone. Medici personnel recoiled in horror while several troopers began vomiting beside the skin. Checkpoint barriers. We moved them into the command bunker under armed guard. I ordered immediate medical examination while recording every detail personally for Ordo archives. Internal scans revealed functioning lungs and vocal cords despite the complete absence of oral cavities. No surgical trauma existed. No signs of cauterization or mutation. Their bodies behaved as though mouths had never belonged there at all. The survivors communicated only through frantic gestures and constant scratching motions against nearby surfaces. Tech Priest Lurker noticed the pattern they carved into the metal table restraints using their own fingernails. A vertical line crossed by smaller horizontal marks. Simple in appearance, yet impossible to focus upon directly. Every observer described the symbol differently moments after looking away. Some recalled 3 crossing lines, others remembered dozens. Lurker scanned the etching repeatedly with a servo skull and discovered the geometry changed fractionally between picked captures. The machine spirit refused stable analysis. Eventually, the tech priest stepped back from the display and spoke in a trembling burst of Binharic. The pattern resembles corrupted prayer code. That afternoon, I reviewed archived administratum records regarding Van's reach. Most references proved mundane: crop tithe reports, forestry yields, labor disputes. Yet buried beneath sealed colonial surveys, I uncovered fragmented mention of disappearances dating back nearly 4 centuries. Entire settlements vanished along the northern forests before imperial governance fully stabilized the planet. Witness accounts described tall figures moving between trees during heavy fog. Every report had been marked heretical and censored by unknown authority. The oldest surviving document referenced a local pre-imperial cult devoted to something called the Tall Witness. Before I could investigate further, alarms erupted across the command bunker. One of the sanctioned psychers attached to the regiment had entered convulsions after examining the carved symbol. I reached the chamber alongside 2 stormtroopers moments before his restraints snapped loose from the bedframe. Blood poured from his nose and eyes while his spine arched violently beneath the skin. He kept screaming the same sentence. "It is learning shape." The temperature inside the Medicae ward plummeted instantly. Frost coated the ceiling pipes. Breath fogged through rebreather filters. Then every Vox receiver in the bunker activated at once, flooding the chamber with overlapping static. Through the distortion came dozens of voices reciting fragments of imperial battle prayers in tones that did not belong to any living soldier present. Colonel Vaya heard his executed predecessor repeating artillery coordinates from a campaign fought 12 years earlier on Casa Vorten. One trooper collapsed after recognizing his brother's voice among the static, despite the man having died during childhood. The psycher's seizure worsened as the whispers intensified. Suddenly, he stopped screaming altogether and stared directly toward the northern wall. "There are footsteps above us," he whispered. "Heavy impacts crossing the bunker roof. Slow, deliberate, measured exactly like the footsteps outside the barricades during the blackout." Security teams swept the upper levels immediately. They found nothing except frost patterns branching across the ferrocrete ceiling in the shape of elongated handprints. Meanwhile, the faceless survivors began convulsing violently. Inside containment, their fingers scraped bloody grooves into the walls while alarms screamed through the bunker. Then all 7 survivors turned simultaneously toward the command viewport overlooking the forest. Something moved between the distant trees. Not quickly, not aggressively. I raised magnoculars toward the northern tree line and saw only fragments clearly through the drifting fog. Black vertical limbs impossibly thin against the crimson light. Height exceeding the surrounding pines. A pale oval, shape hovering where no face should exist. The figure vanished the instant direct focus settled upon it. Yet the faceless survivors continued shaking uncontrollably long after it disappeared. One seized a shard of broken metal from the containment floor and carved words across the nearest chimera transport before the guards restrained. "Him. He is still ascending." Before anyone could question the meaning, every missing patrol beacon across the northern sectors activated simultaneously upon the tactical display. Dozens of signals, all moving toward Outpost Grey in perfect formation. And none of the signals slowed whatsoever. Dawn arrived slowly over Outpost Grey, dragging pale red light through the frost-coated barricades, while every alarm rune on the tactical display continued blinking in synchronized rhythm. The patrol beacons advancing through the northern forest never deviated once from formation. Dozens of signals moved at identical speed despite terrain differences that should have scattered them across kilometers of woodland. Colonel Vaya ordered artillery crews into firing positions before sunrise. No one argued. Even the most hardened Cadians had stopped pretending we faced a conventional threat. The fog reached the outer trenches first. It rolled low between the razor wire in long pale currents, thick enough to swallow the lower barricades entirely. Auspex operators reported intermittent contact signatures emerging within it, though range readings fluctuated impossibly. One moment, the contacts stood 3 kilometers north. The next they appeared directly beyond the minefields before vanishing again. Tech Priest Lurker insisted the machine. Spirits themselves had become unreliable. Then the procession emerged from the pines. Hundreds of figures walked silently through the fog toward Outpost Grey. At first glance they resembled exhausted survivors returning from failed patrol operations. Tattered Cadian flak armor hung from skeletal frames. Some still carried lascans lowered harmlessly at their sides. Yet the proportions were wrong. Arms extended too far beneath coat sleeves. Legs bent strangely during movement. Joints flexing with uneven timing like poorly assembled servitors. Their bodies looked stretched vertically beneath their uniforms, flesh pulled taut over elongated bone. No one among them spoke. No one blinked. The Eastern Sentry line nearly opened fire automatically until Colonel Vea screamed for restraint across the command vox. I raised magnoculars and recognized regimental insignia belonging to patrol groups missing for weeks. Mud and frost coated their uniforms, yet none showed visible wounds. They simply continued advancing until they reached the outer minefields. Then they stopped simultaneously. The silence that followed felt heavier than artillery bombardment. Hundreds of pale figures stood motionless beyond the wire, staring toward the compound. Their shadows stretched westward across the frozen ground despite the figures' rising sun positioned behind them in the eastern sky. Several troopers noticed immediately. One whispered a prayer to the Emperor before putting his own las pistol beneath his chin. Sergeant Halvek knocked the weapon aside. Moments before discharge, I ordered picked capture servitors deployed along the wall. Every image returned distorted. The figures appeared blurred vertically, their outlines elongated by static interference. Behind them, the forests seemed darker than before, as though the trees themselves absorbed surrounding light. Lurker attempted spectral analysis and abruptly shut down his console after seeing the results. When pressed for explanation, he answered only through clipped binharic fragments. The shadows are facing the wrong way because the illumination source is wrong. No one understood what he meant. An hour passed without movement. The procession remained fixed beyond the minefields while frost spread slowly across the outer barricades despite increasing daylight temperatures. Some of the standing figures twitched, occasionally with abrupt spasms running beneath their uniforms. One man's neck lengthened visibly while we watched, vertebrae cracking softly beneath stretched skin until his head tilted several centimeters higher than human anatomy allowed. The troops began forgetting things by midday. At first, the lapses appeared minor. A mortar crew misplaced ammunition inventories they had checked moments earlier. Vox operators struggled recalling standard recognition codes. Then Captain Wren approached me during perimeter inspection and asked why Barracks 3 remained empty. Barracks 3 housed 61 soldiers. When I brought him there personally, he stared at the occupied structure in visible confusion. Minutes later, he could describe neither the building's location nor the conversation itself. Similar incidents spread through the compound rapidly. Names disappeared from duty rosters between inspections. Entire maintenance logs turned blank overnight. One terrified clerk insisted the regiment had arrived on Van's Reach with 2 additional companies no one else remembered. I began recording every detail manually on parchment because Cogitator archives no longer retained stable data. That evening, the faceless survivors from the Medici ward entered simultaneous convulsions the moment the sun dipped below the forests. Their restraints snapped against the bed frames while orderlies fled screaming from the 5 chamber. I arrived beside the Medicae staff in time to witness all 7 survivors pointing toward the northern windows with trembling fingers. The procession had moved closer. No alarms sounded. No sentry reported movement. Yet the elongated figures now stood directly beyond the outer minefields less than 300 meters from the walls. Frost steamed around their boots. Their pale skin reflected the dying crimson sunlight with corpse-like stillness. And behind them stood something taller. At first I mistook it for a damaged watchtower rising above the trees. Then lightning flashed across the distant clouds. The silhouette moved. It towered above the surrounding forest canopy by impossible meters, impossibly thin against the storm-lit horizon. Long black limbs hung beside a body draped in darkness that shifted like wet funeral cloth caught beneath deep water. Its head appeared smooth and pale without visible eyes or mouth. I tried focusing directly upon the face, and immediately felt blood running from my nose. All along the battlements, soldiers began screaming. Some clawed at their eyes. Others collapsed convulsing beside heavy bolters while blood streamed from beneath their eyelids. Every vox channel erupted into shrieking static. The towering figure remained motionless between the trees while the storm intensified overhead. Then it vanished. Not gradually. One heartbeat it stood above the forest. The next, the space was empty. Before anyone recovered, the tactical aspects emitted a piercing warning tone. Deep within the northern woods, far beyond every known logging sector, a new structure appeared upon the scans. Massive, vertical, impossible, a cathedral-sized tower where no structure had existed 6 hours earlier. Its outline pulsed a wound opening inside reality itself. Colonel Vare asked me what could construct something so vast without detection. I remember staring toward the impossible tower and realizing that the forest around it no longer appeared natural either. We reached the impossible structure shortly before nightfall under orders issued directly through inquisitorial authority. Colonel Vare remained behind at Outpost Grey to maintain the perimeter while I accompanied the advance team into the northern forests. The procession of elongated figures still stood beyond the minefields when we departed. None attempted pursuit. They merely watched us disappear among the trees. The journey toward the tower should have taken 4 hours according to the Auspex readings gathered earlier that day. Instead, it took nearly 9. Distances inside the northern forests no longer behaved consistently. Trails twisted without reason. Compass needles rotated continuously. Entire sections of woodland repeated themselves with impossible precision, forcing the Chimera convoy to pass the same burned logging vehicle 3 separate times despite traveling westward. Even the weather moved incorrectly. Snow fell upward through the branches while warm rain descended, simultaneously around us. No wildlife remained anywhere beneath the canopy. The silence worsened the deeper we traveled. Engines sounded muted beneath the trees, as though the forest consumed echoes before they fully formed. Occasionally someone glimpsed movement between the trunks ahead of the convoy, always too tall and thin to be human. Every sighting lasted less than a second, yet each report increased the same pressure building inside my skull, a sensation resembling half-remembered panic clawing toward recognition. By the 6th hour, several troopers stopped speaking entirely. Tech Priest Lurker blamed atmospheric contamination and distributed rebreather filters layered with sacred incense. The filters changed nothing. Guardsmen continued glancing nervously toward the spaces between trees while whispering fragments of childhood prayers under their breath. Sergeant Halvek confessed he could no longer remember his mother's face. Another trooper swore the convoy originally contained 2 additional chimeras now missing from formation. None of us could verify his claim with certainty. Then the forest ended. The trees simply stopped in a perfect circular boundary nearly 2 kilometers wide. Beyond them rose the tower. It resembled a cathedral grown rather than constructed. Black pillars twisted upward like fused trunks wrapped together beneath immense arches resembling rib bones. Sections of the structure appeared wet despite freezing temperatures, its surfaces glistening faintly beneath the crimson moonlight. No windows reflected illumination from our flood lamps. The entire basilica absorbed light into itself, leaving only dull outlines visible against the night sky. Most disturbing of all was the scale. Auspex scans had failed to capture its true height. The upper spires disappeared into low storm clouds far above the forest canopy. Bells hung between the distant arches, though no wind moved them. I remember realizing the structure possessed no visible entrances until one slowly opened directly before us. Not mechanically. The wall itself separated like flesh pulled apart by invisible hands. Several troopers began reciting the litany of pure form immediately. Others refused to leave the transports. I ordered the advance regardless. Duty remained stronger than fear then. I still believed the horror on Vans. Reach could be studied, contained, perhaps even destroyed through proper imperial sanction. Inside, the laws of architecture ceased functioning. The entry corridor extended impossibly far beyond the external dimensions of the tower. Black stone walls curved inward like the interior of a throat. Candles burned along alcoves carved directly into living wood that pulsed faintly beneath the wax. Their flames produced no warmth. Frost coated every surface despite temperatures rising sharply on our instruments. Our footsteps echoed before we moved. The sound reached us several seconds early, as though unseen versions of ourselves walked ahead through the corridor. One Kasachin trooper vomited inside his rebreather after noticing the phenomenon. Another fired his hellgun into the ceiling when he heard whispering emerge from the walls in his dead wife's voice. The deeper chambers contained murals unlike any Imperial art form I had encountered. Towering faceless figures stretched across the walls beside kneeling crowds stripped of mouths and eyes. Entire civilizations appeared depicted, surrendering themselves willingly to elongated shadows descending from darkened skies. Tech Priest Lurker translated fragments of corrupted High Gothic inscribed beneath the images. "A name is a door," the phrase repeated constantly, sometimes carved into stone, sometimes stitched into human skin hanging from the arches overhead. We discovered the first bodies shortly afterward. Dozens of human forms had been fused directly into the walls lining a massive chapel chamber. Their limbs protruded outward beneath layers of bark-like growth while pale faces remained exposed above the surface. None appeared decayed. Their eyes moved slowly as we entered. Several mouths opened soundlessly in desperate attempts to scream. Then the servitors malfunctioned. Without warning, every combat servitor accompanying the expedition stopped moving simultaneously. Their optic lenses turned toward the upper vaults, while static burst from their vox emitters in harsh rhythmic pulses. Lurker attempted emergency override commands through Binharik broadcast. The machine units ignored him completely. One servitor raised its heavy bolter toward Sergeant Halvek. Another pointed directly at me. Then all 6 machines spoke together in the same distorted voice. "He is becoming visible." The chapel lights extinguished instantly. Darkness swallowed the chamber except for the black candle flames trembling along the distant walls. Panic spread through the troopers. Lasgun safeties clicked off around me while someone screamed near the rear entrance. I activated my hand lumen and caught brief glimpses of movement among the fused bodies lining the walls. One of them opened its eyes fully. Its face stretched unnaturally thin against the bark-covered stone while cracked lips peeled apart with wet tearing sounds. When it spoke, the voice resembled branches snapping beneath heavy snow. "He seeks apotheosis." Somewhere far above us, within the unseen reaches of the basilica, enormous bells began tolling through the darkness. The sound carried no resonance through air or stone. Instead, it vibrated directly inside the skull. With each toll, another member of the expedition forgot a prayer they had known for years. At that exact moment, the entrance behind us sealed shut like closing flesh, and every lumen in the basilica died. Darkness inside the basilica did not resemble ordinary absence of light. It behaved like pressure. The moment the lumens died, the air itself seemed to thicken around us, heavy and cold against the lungs. Breathing became difficult. Even the faint red emergency runes glowing across our armor plates appeared swallowed beneath layers of moving blackness. Then the corridor changed shape. I heard Sergeant Halvik curse somewhere behind me as the floor tilted sharply beneath our boots. Several troopers lost footing while the walls groaned with sounds resembling old timber bending during storms. When my hand lumen flickered back to life, the chapel chamber no longer resembled the structure we had entered moments earlier. The ceiling had risen impossibly high above us. The fused bodies lining the walls were gone. In their place stood towering black pillars carved with the same vertical symbols the faceless survivors had scratched into the bunker walls at Outpost Grey. The symbols crawled slowly across the stone whenever viewed indirectly. I caught myself staring too long at one, and immediately forgot the final words of the litany against possession, a prayer I had recited daily since childhood. Tech Priest Lurker began transmitting panicked Binharik bursts through the squad vox. "The dimensions are rearranging according to observation," he said. "The architecture is responsive." That realization spread through the group like poison. Every corridor beyond the chapel shifted subtly whenever multiple people looked away simultaneously. Distances lengthened or shortened without transition. Doorways vanished from walls only to reappear elsewhere moments later. At one intersection, Trooper Velk walked barely 5 meters ahead of us before disappearing around a corner. We pursued immediately and found only an empty passage extending in the wrong direction. No screams. No gunfire. Just absence. Within minutes, several members of the squad argued over whether Velk had accompanied us at all. His name vanished from the tactical roster shortly afterward. The bells above continued tolling at irregular intervals. Each vibration sent pain through the skull like pressure spikes inside the eyes. Worse still, every toll corresponded with another memory lapse among the surviving expedition members. A Kaskin corporal forgot the activation rites for his Hellgun. One of the stormtroopers could no longer remember which planet he had been born upon. I caught myself struggling to recall the exact face of the Emperor depicted in chapel mosaics aboard the St. Ossuary. Fear became procedural then, measured, contained beneath discipline and ritual. That was the only reason we survived deeper descent into the basilica. Lurker eventually identified recurring geometric patterns embedded throughout the structure. The arrangement of pillars matched the 8 tree formations surrounding Outpost Grey. Hallways curved according to impossible, angular symmetry. Entire chambers aligned into concentric circles around a central point buried somewhere beneath the cathedral foundations. "This is not architecture," Lurker whispered. "It is ritual mathematics." The realization changed everything. The basilica had not been built for habitation or worship in any conventional sense. It was a mechanism, a planetary-scale ritual engine using geometry itself as liturgical function. The forests outside were part of the same design. So were the missing settlements, the erased records, the faceless survivors. Every event on Van's Reach formed part of a structure far larger than Imperial understanding. Something was reshaping reality through pattern and recognition. And it was still incomplete. Hours passed without measurable time reference. Chronometers malfunctioned continuously inside the basilica. Eventually we entered a vast circular chamber where pale figures wandered aimlessly between hanging black candles. At first I believed them to be cultists. Then I noticed their clothing. None matched modern Imperial design. One man wore rusted armor belonging to regiments disbanded during the Macharian Crusade. Another carried mining equipment manufactured nearly 3,000 years earlier, according to Mechanicus pattern codes. A woman dressed in archaic voidsman robes sat against the wall humming softly, while blood leaked from her empty eye sockets. They were all human, all alive, and all impossibly old. The wandering figures ignored us initially. Some whispered prayers in extinct dialects. Others scratched symbols into the floor with broken fingernails. One ancient guardsman approached Sergeant Halvek slowly, staring upward with trembling pale eyes. "Do not let it learn your name," he whispered. Halvek demanded identification. The old man frowned in visible confusion. After several seconds he answered quietly, "I no longer remember." Then his jaw unhinged vertically with a wet cracking sound. The troopers opened fire instantly. Hellgun bursts tore through the ancient man's chest and threw him backward across the chamber. Yet no blood emerged from the wounds. Only darkness spilled from inside the corpse like smoke escaping beneath pressure. Every wandering figure turned toward us simultaneously. We retreated immediately through the adjoining corridors while the bells above intensified into constant reverberation. The ancient humans did not pursue quickly. They simply followed at walking pace, their footsteps echoing in perfect synchronization through the shifting halls behind us. During retreat we discovered the central chamber. 8 colossal pillars surrounded a circular pit descending beyond visible depth. Human skin stretched across the pillars in immense parchment sheets covered with millions of handwritten names. Some appeared freshly inked. Others had faded almost completely into the pale flesh beneath them. Lurker identified worlds listed there that no longer existed within Imperial star charts. Forgotten places, erased histories, consumed identities. My hand froze when the lumen crossed one particular section of skin scroll near the eastern pillar. I recognized my own surname written there in fresh black ink. No one in the expedition had spoken it aloud since arriving on Van's Reach. Before I could react, the sanctioned psyker attached to our team collapsed beside the pit screaming. Blood poured from his nose while unseen pressure bent his body backward against the stone floor. The bells ceased instantly. Silence swallowed the chamber. Then the psyker seized a broken fragment of metal from the ground and carved words into the stone with frantic, desperate movements. It can hear thoughts that form into language. The moment he finished writing, he tore out his own tongue with both hands. And somewhere deep beneath the basilica, something enormous began moving upward toward us through the darkness below the pit. The movement beneath the pit continued long after the psyker collapsed unconscious beside the carved warning. At first, the sound resembled distant stone grinding against stone somewhere beneath the basilica foundations. Then the rhythm changed. Slow impacts echoed upward through the darkness below us with unmistakable cadence. Footsteps. Every surviving member of the expedition recognized the pattern immediately. The same measured pace that had approached Outpost Grey through the frost. The same impossible rhythm heard above the bunker ceiling while the lumens failed. Except now the sound carried immense weight behind it, as though something colossal climbed steadily toward the chamber through endless unseen depths. No one spoke. After the psyker's warning, language itself had become dangerous. We retreated from the central chamber using hand signals and tactical rune flashes across our wrist displays. Even whispered communication ceased entirely. The silence transformed the basilica into something worse than before. Without speech to anchor perception, every shifting corridor felt detached from human certainty. Our breathing sounded too loud. Armor joints creaked like breaking bone. Somewhere far behind us, the ancient wandering figures continued following at their patient, unchanging pace. Tech Priest Lurker adapted quickly. He converted squad coordination into compressed binaric pulse signals transmitted directly through localized data bursts. Even then, he limited communication to essential tactical instructions. Any thought forming too clearly now carried the possibility of being heard, not overheard. Consumed. As we descended deeper through the rearranging corridors, the basilica itself began responding to our silence. Walls flexed subtly beneath dim lumen light like living muscle tightening around prey. Doorways opened before us without visible mechanisms. Black candles ignited spontaneously along distant passages moments before our arrival. The structure wanted movement. It guided us downward with deliberate intent. Hours may have passed, possibly days. Time no longer remained trustworthy inside the cathedral. Eventually, we reached a chamber filled with dormant Vox machinery unlike any Imperial construction I had encountered. Hundreds of ancient communication pylons rose from the floor in concentric circles surrounding a central transmitter. A ray fused directly into the stone. Thick cables resembling black veins disappeared into the surrounding walls where they pulsed faintly with internal light. Most disturbing were the voices. Every inactive Vox unit whispered softly despite lacking power sources. Thousands of fragmented transmissions overlapped throughout the chamber. I recognized military distress calls, childhood prayers, execution orders, confessions, and broken screams spoken in hundreds of different dialects. Some voices repeated endlessly. Others ended abruptly mid-sentence. Several belonged to people standing beside me. Sergeant Halvik froze when he heard his own voice emerge from a nearby transmitter begging someone unseen not to forget his name. The recording ended with wet choking noises followed by static. Halvik insisted he had never spoken those words. I believed him. Lurker interfaced with the central array through mechadendrite links, while the rest of us secured the chamber perimeter. Data floods surged visibly through his optical implants. At first he transmitted only fragmented bursts of binary prayer. Then his metallic limbs began shaking uncontrollably. Finally, he disconnected himself violently from the system. Black oil streamed from his nose vents. The Vox network extends across the entire planet, he rasped through damaged vocal emitters. It is using communication infrastructure as ritual architecture. He showed us the recovered data projections. Outside the basilica, Van's reach had descended into systemic collapse. Outpost Grey no longer maintained stable contact with orbital command. Entire platoons wandered into the forests without orders, abandoning fortifications and weapons alike. Refugee convoys disappeared between settlements, despite traveling open roads beneath aerial surveillance. Every major Vox network on the planet now carried intermittent bursts of distorted whispering beneath standard communications. Worse still, orbital vessels reported impossible visual phenomena spreading through the atmosphere below. Colossal shadows moving within the storm systems. Shapes too large to belong to anything living. The realization struck me slowly as I studied the corrupted transmissions flooding across the display screens. The entity was expanding through recognition itself. Every frightened report, every whispered rumor, every terrified witness. The more humanity perceived the phenomenon, the stronger it became. Lurker uncovered deeper records buried within the ancient transmitter core. Much of the data had degraded beyond interpretation, yet enough survived to reveal the truth hidden beneath centuries of censorship. Long before Imperial colonization, Van's Reach contained a sealed anomaly dating back to the dark age of technology. Human researchers discovered a localized warp breach beneath the northern forests where psychic resonance accumulated abnormally around fear responses and isolation trauma. At first, the presence within the breach had been minor. Not a demon, not even fully sentient. Merely a predatory warp intelligence feeding upon forgotten deaths, loneliness, and the terror of unseen pursuit. But humanity had shaped it gradually over millennia. Primitive cults gave the fear form. Disappearances gave it mythology. Imperial censorship buried the stories deep enough to mature. In darkness, every frightened child imagining something tall beyond their bedroom door fed the same growing archetype within the warp. Now, beneath the endless despair of the 41st millennium, the entity had become something far worse. It is ascending toward demonhood, Lurker whispered. Not naturally, not through the patronage of any chaos god. It was becoming a Daemon prince through collective human recognition itself. A mimetic divinity born from the terror of being forgotten. The chamber lights failed immediately afterward. Every Vox machine activated simultaneously. Static erupted around us with such force that several troopers collapsed, clutching bleeding ears. Across hundreds of speakers, thousands of overlapping voices merged slowly into singular coherence. The sound resembled oceans of whispers compressing into one impossible throat. Then it spoke, not loudly, not angrily. The voice arrived with intimate calm directly inside the mind. You have always known me. Several troopers opened fire instantly into the darkness surrounding the chamber. Last bolts struck stone pillars and ricocheted wildly through clouds of smoke. One stormtrooper tore off his helmet, screaming that something stood behind him. Another began clawing at his own face until Sergeant Halvek restrained him against the floor. Through the flickering emergency lumens, I saw movement near the central transmitter array. Long black limbs unfolding slowly upward from the shadows between the Vox pylons. Too tall, too thin. The pale suggestion of a featureless face turning toward us through the static-filled dark. Then every communication unit across the chamber began broadcasting the same sentence repeatedly in corrupted High Gothic. He is becoming visible. And somewhere far above us, within the shifting darkness of the basilica, enormous bells began tolling again. The bells did not simply resume their tolling. They reasserted themselves into reality, as if silence had never been permitted in the first place. Each resonance struck through the chamber in slow, deliberate intervals, compressing the air until breathing itself felt like resistance against an unseen weight. The Vox pylons continued broadcasting their unified phrase, but the entity's presence within the chamber withdrew slightly, as though it were no longer concerned with immediate confrontation. That shift mattered more than any attack. I recognized retreat when I saw it. Not from fear, from preparation. The emergency lumen systems flickered erratically as we withdrew from the collapsed Vox chamber. The corridors outside no longer behaved with the same fluid distortion as before. Instead, they had stabilized into something worse. Consistency. Every passage now repeated identical architectural patterns at precise intervals. Pillars aligned with mathematical inevitability. Doorways appeared at fixed distances. The basilica was no longer changing. Randomly, it was organizing itself. Sergeant Halvek noticed it first, whispering through clenched teeth that the structure felt settled. Lurker corrected him immediately through binharic bursts, warning that stabilization indicated completion of a ritual phase. The basilica was no longer adapting to our presence. It had reached a stage where our movement no longer mattered. We were inside a finished design. As we advanced upward through a series of arched corridors, the air grew colder, not naturally so, but in layered gradients, as if temperature itself was arranged in deliberate architectural bands. Frost formed in repeating geometric patterns along the walls. Each pattern mirrored the same 8-pointed arrangement we had observed across the walls. Forest canopy outside outpost gray. The symbolism was no longer incidental. It was structural law. We entered what should have been a transitional hall leading back toward the basilica's upper levels. Instead, it opened into a vast necropolis chamber that none of our scans had previously registered. The space was immense, its ceiling disappearing into darkness far above the reach of our lumen beams. Rows upon rows of statues lined both sides of a central avenue stretching into unseen distance. At first glance they appeared to be carved saints. Imperial iconography suggested reverence, ascension, sanctity. Armored figures with bowed heads, robed scholars clutching relic texts, angels rendered in the familiar Gothic interpretation of divine service. All aligned in perfect procession facing inward toward the central path. Then I noticed the detail that broke understanding. None of them had faces. Not mutilated, not eroded. Absent entirely. Smooth stone where features should have been, as though identity itself had never been assigned to them. The effect was not uniform either. Each statue lacked individuality in a different way. Some had elongated skulls tapering into blankness. Others possessed subtle impressions where eyes should have been, but no depth beneath them. A few had shapes suggesting mouths that were never carved fully into existence. The realization spread through the squad in silence. These were not saints. They were records. Preserved absence. We advanced slowly through the necropolis avenue. Every step echoed too clearly, as though the chamber amplified sound selectively. The statues remained motionless, yet their orientation created an illusion of attention. It felt as though thousands of faceless observers were tracking our movement without eyes. Then one of the statues moved. A sound like stone fracturing under internal pressure echoed from the left flank. Sergeant Halvek immediately raised his weapon, but I ordered restraint through a raised hand signal. The statue closest to us had tilted its head slightly downward. A crack formed along its smooth surface. Not random damage. A controlled split. From within the stone, something pale pressed outward. At first I believed it was erosion exposing hidden material. Then the stone peeled away in layered fragments resembling dried skin. Beneath it was not sculpture, but flesh preserved in impossible stasis. A human form embedded within the statue, stretched into the same faceless condition as the survivors at Outpost Grey. Its mouth opened. No sound emerged. Instead, a wave of static passed through every Vox unit still functioning within the squad. All communication devices simultaneously shifted to the same frequency. The voice that emerged was not individual, but collective, as though every faceless saint across the chamber spoke at once through a single broken channel. "You are still being remembered wrong." The statues responded. Every figure along the necropolis avenue began cracking open in slow synchronization. Stone surfaces peeled away like old paint, revealing hundreds of trapped bodies beneath. Some still wore fragments of Imperial uniforms. Others carried archaic equipment from forgotten centuries. All shared the same absence where faces should have been. None of them screamed. They simply turned their featureless heads toward us. The avenue behind us sealed instantly. Not through collapse, but alignment. The corridor restructured itself into solid wall geometry, erasing the path of retreat entirely. We were not trapped in a chamber anymore. We were embedded inside it. Lurker attempted emergency routing protocols through his mechadendrites, but his systems returned only fragmented readings. The basilica was no longer registering as a navigable structure. It had become a closed circuit of symbolic architecture, with no external exit vectors. Sergeant Halvek began firing into the nearest saint. The lasbolts struck the exposed flesh beneath the stone, but instead of penetration, the impact produced a resonance effect. The entire chamber vibrated in response. Every faceless figure along the avenue turned slightly more toward us. Then they began walking, not rushing, not attacking, advancing in slow, synchronized procession. Each movement matched the same cadence as the bells we had heard above the basilica since arrival. Each step reinforced the rhythm deeper into the structure itself. The sound was not mechanical anymore. It felt biological, as though the entire necropolis chamber had become a breathing organism. I realized then what the geometry represented. We were standing inside a memory that refused to forget itself, and something inside it was rewriting us. The faceless saints advanced closer, and behind them the stone walls began to soften again, losing structural rigidity. The basilica was preparing another transition phase. Lurker turned toward me. Vox output reduced to broken fragments. "They are not attacking," he said. "They are reclassifying us." One of the saints reached forward and placed a hand on Halvik's shoulder. Where it touched, the armor dissolved into static, and Halvik's face began to blur. Halvik did not scream when his face began to blur. The sound that came from him was worse than pain. It was confusion collapsing inward, like a man realizing the rules of his own body were being revised without consent. The saint's hand remained pressed against his shoulder, unmoving, patient, as if it had all the time in the galaxy. Where Halvik's features should have been, there was only distortion. Not injury, not mutation. A soft erosion of definition, as though reality itself could no longer justify remembering him in detail. His name still existed in my mind when I tried to speak it, but the sound refused to form in my throat. Behind us, the faceless saints continued their advance through the necropolis chamber. Lurker issued a binharic rupture command, flooding his mechadendrites with emergency counter-frequency pulses. The effect was immediate but unstable. The nearest saints slowed for a fraction of a second, as if momentarily confused by the interference, before resuming movement with adjusted cadence. They were learning resistance patterns. That realization turned my stomach cold. We were not fighting an enemy that reacted. We were inside something that adapted through observation. The chamber's geometry began shifting again. Not dramatically this time, but subtly, like a living thought refining itself. Columns aligned more precisely. Distances between statues recalculated in ways too small for conscious perception but significant enough to alter navigation. The basilica was compressing possibilities, limiting outcomes, eliminating escape paths before they were chosen. A trooper on the left flank fired a panic volley into the advancing saints. His shots struck multiple targets, but instead of stopping the movement, the impact caused synchronized tremors across the entire chamber. Every faceless head tilted slightly toward him at once. Then the trooper forgot how to fire his weapon. I watched him stare at the trigger mechanism like it belonged to another life. He mouthed something silently, then dropped the hellgun as if it had become unfamiliar weight. A saint reached him before anyone could intervene. Where it touched his chest plate, the ceramite surface dulled, then flattened into featureless gray. His identity followed immediately after. The squad was dissolving in real time. Not physically. Conceptually. Lurker shouted that the basilica was executing a progressive semantic collapse protocol, stripping targets of definitional anchors, names first, then faces, then functional memory, finally structural recognition. By the time he finished speaking, the trooper who had dropped his weapon could no longer recognize the concept of weapon at all. He simply stood still while the saints passed through him, and he was no longer described as present. He was absent. The necropolis avenue began echoing with something new beneath the tolling bells, a secondary rhythm, quieter, layered underneath the primary cadence. At first I mistook it for distant machinery. Then I realized it was speech. Not spoken, compiled. Thousands of fragmented human voices forming a single continuous litany repeating through the walls themselves. Names were being spoken, but never fully completed. Every syllable broke before resolution, as though the structure refused finality. I recognized pieces of them, partial identifiers, rank designations, planetary origins. But none could be held long enough to stabilize into meaning. The litany of the missing was not prayer. It was deletion in progress. Another saint reached forward, this time toward me. I fired instinctively, the recoil snapping through my arm as the bolt discharged. The impact struck the saint's chest and detonated outward in a burst of fractured stone and pale fluid. For a moment it staggered, and I felt something like relief. Then the fragments reassembled. Not healing, rewriting. The damaged portions simply became undefined space for a moment before resolving into new, identical structure. The saint continued walking, uninterrupted, unreduced, unchanged in essence. Lurker grabbed my shoulder and forced me backward through a narrowing gap between two collapsing columns. He transmitted rapid binaric directives directly into my armor's cognition relay. They cannot be destroyed, the translation resolved. They are stabilized absence. Physical negation is irrelevant. Behind us, Halvek finally collapsed to his knees. His face was almost entirely gone now. Only faint contours remained where recognition once anchored itself. He was still alive, breathing, moving, but no longer fully present in any perceptible sense that the basilica acknowledged. The saints surrounded him, and then they stopped. All movement ceased simultaneously across the entire necropolis chamber. Even the bells above halted mid-toll. Silence returned so completely it felt engineered. The saints turned their faceless attention toward a single point beyond us. Not toward me, not toward Lurker, but deeper, toward something further inside the basilica structure. A new vibration passed through the walls, lower in frequency than the bells, slower, heavier. The chamber itself seemed to acknowledge it with something like reverence. Lurker's vox fractured into alarmed static bursts. "The central geometry is activating," he transmitted. "We are being redirected." The floor beneath us shifted. Not collapsing, reorienting. The Necropolis Avenue reconfigured itself into a descending incline, pulling us forward despite resistance. The saints did not pursue anymore. They simply stood aside as if their function in this phase had concluded. Halvek's body was lifted by unseen force and carried with us, still breathing, still erasing. As we were drawn deeper, I understood the structure's logic with horrifying clarity. The basilica did not kill, it edited, and we were now entering the section where incomplete records were finalized. Ahead, the darkness thickened into something more structured than absence. It had edges, boundaries, geometry that could not be properly seen but could be felt pressing against perception itself. The litany of the missing continued through the walls, now slower, more deliberate, as if preparing to finish our names. The descent did not feel like movement anymore. It felt like permission being withdrawn layer by layer, as if the basilica was deciding how far we were still allowed to exist inside it. The litany of the missing faded behind us, not because it stopped, but because something deeper in the structure began speaking over it. A new voice, not transmitted, not echoed, declared. It arrived through the stone itself, resonating through bone and cognition simultaneously. Even Lurker's binaric shielding faltered for a moment, his mechadendrites locking mid-transmission as corrupted priority signals flooded his systems. The saints above us did not follow. They did not need to. Whatever lay ahead rendered pursuit unnecessary. We entered a space where the geometry no longer obeyed vertical logic. Corridors folded sideways into vaulted emptiness that defied directional certainty. Floors tilted into walls without transition. Entire segments of architecture appeared suspended in impossible equilibrium, as though gravity had been replaced with theological intent. The air here tasted metallic, like old incense burned over too many forgotten rituals. Then we saw them. The word-bearers. They emerged from fractured arches ahead of us, their armor marked by heretical scripture carved deep into ceramite plates. Red and black plates glistened with oil and ash, each legionnaire bearing devotional scars etched into both machine and flesh. They were not surprised to see us. They had been expecting witnesses. At their center stood a dark apostle, his crucius raised like a spire of corrupted faith. Behind him, lesser cultists knelt in formation, chanting in synchronized cadence that merged imperial liturgy with something far older and more fractured. Every word they spoke carried dual meaning, devotion on the surface, erasure beneath. Lurker identified the frequency immediately. "They are harmonizing with the basilica," he transmitted. "Their worship is stabilizing the anomaly." The apostle turned toward us slowly. When he spoke, His voice did not travel. It arrived fully formed inside thought. "You have walked far enough to be counted," he said. The words were not a threat. They were classification. Around us, the architecture responded again. Walls softened into pulsing organic stone, veins of black light threading through structural seams. The basilica was no longer separate from its occupants. It was merging interpretive frameworks, faith, fear, recognition, and absence, into a single evolving system. The word-bearers began their ritual without command. Chanting escalated into overlapping liturgical spirals that bent perception itself. Each syllable acted like a key turning inside unseen locks. The air thickened with pressure as if reality was being compressed into smaller, interpretive states. The saint's litany from earlier now returned faintly beneath everything, merging with chaos scripture in an unstable synthesis. Gospel formation. Not written. Not spoken. Constructed through belief convergence. Lurker staggered as his systems overloaded with conflicting data streams. He transmitted one final coherent assessment before partial shutdown. "The entity is being given doctrinal structure," he said. "It is becoming something the warp can recognize as legitimate existence." That was when I saw it again. Not fully formed. Not stable. But present in overlapping fragments between perception gaps. The tall figure. It stood behind the apostle at first, then beside him, then above him without moving in any observable way. Each observation changed its placement. Each attempt to focus on it reduced clarity. Its outline was wrong in dimensions that refused correction. Limbs too long to belong to any coherent anatomy. A face that suggested absence more than emptiness. And now it was being named. The apostle lifted his arms. "We give form to what was always unspoken," he declared. "We give voice to the one who walks between recognition." The word-bearers intensified their chant. Blood began running from beneath their helmets, not from injury, but from internal pressure, as if belief itself was forcing physical sacrifice. The basilica responded in kind. Pillars vibrated. The floor beneath us softened into layered stone that pulsed like a heartbeat. Then the entity spoke again. Not to us. Not to them. Through them. "I am that which is not recorded." The words fractured every communication system still functioning in the chamber. Vox units overloaded instantly. Lurker's remaining output reduced to emergency pulses. "Containment threshold collapsing," he transmitted. "It is synchronizing with external worship vectors." The word-bearers were not summoning it. They were accelerating its completion. The tall entity extended one limb toward the central axis of the chamber. Where it touched space, reality lost definition entirely. Symbols carved across the basilica walls began rearranging themselves into unfamiliar sequences. The 8-point geometry that had governed everything until now shifted into something more complex, more recursive, a pattern that repeated itself while changing. The gospel was forming. Halvek, still partially erased, began to move beside me without instruction. His remaining features flickered as though struggling to stabilize. He looked toward the entity, and for the first time since the necropolis chamber, I saw recognition attempt to return to him, then fail. The apostle's voice rose into final crescendo. "Let the tall king ascend beyond forgetting." The chamber answered, not with sound, with rewriting. Every name, every inscription, every fragment of identity embedded within the basilica's structure ignited simultaneously. The litany of the missing transformed into something else entirely. No longer absence, no longer warning. It became affirmation. And the entity began to solidify into a single coherent presence for the first time since we entered Van's reach. Not emerging from the warp, but being completed by it. The moment the gospel stabilized, the basilica changed its behavior again. Not violently, not chaotically, but with administrative precision, as if a final authorization had been signed somewhere beyond perception. The chanting of the word-bearers faltered first, then collapsed entirely into ragged breathing. Even the dark apostle lowered his arms, as though receiving an order only he could hear. Then everything went quiet. Not the absence of sound we had experienced before, but a deliberate removal of transmission itself. The chamber stopped echoing. Vox systems failed without static. Even breathing seemed dampened, stripped of its acoustic presence. It felt as though the basilica had enacted a rule. Nothing within it was permitted to be heard unless it served the structure. Lurker attempted emergency relay bursts. No output registered. His mechadendrites twitched in confused loops before retracting slightly, as if uncertain whether communication was still a valid function. The surrounding word-bearers stood motionless, their ritual abruptly suspended mid-ascension. Blood still dripped from their armor seams, but even that sound disappeared before reaching the air. The tall entity remained present at the chamber's center, but now it was no longer fluctuating between states. It was stable, defined, not fully revealed, but no longer resisting observation. Its presence pressed against reality like a finalized conclusion. And then, the silence protocol began. We did not hear it announced. We felt it implemented. Every communication device across the basilica deactivated in sequence. First Vox receivers, then suit links, then secondary sensory relays, one by one. Systems designed for coordination and identity reinforcement shut down, not due to damage, but due to rejection. The structure no longer recognized the necessity of exchange. Lurker tried to compensate through direct binaric signaling, bypassing standard channels. For a brief moment, his data pulses reached me clearly. Then even that collapsed. The basilica adapted to non-verbal transmission as efficiently as it had adapted to speech. It was removing all forms of shared cognition. Sergeant Halvek, what remained of him, stumbled beside me. His partially erased face flickered with unstable definition, but now even that instability was fading. He looked at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. For the first time since the necropolis, he spoke without voice. Not through sound. Through loss. I cannot remember how to be here. The sentence formed directly inside my perception and immediately weakened. Even thought itself was becoming unstable. The silence protocol did not simply suppress communication, it dismantled the architecture of shared understanding. Concepts began separating from their labels. Objects no longer triggered consistent recognition across individuals. A weapon could be seen but not collectively identified as such. A corridor could exist without being agreed upon. The basilica was enforcing isolation at the level of perception. Outside the chamber, distant sections of the structure responded. We felt it through shifting gravity and subtle displacements in spatial awareness. Entire corridors were being rewritten into non-communicative structures. Routes that had once connected us to escape points now looped back into themselves without continuity. The basilica was sealing informational pathways first, physical pathways second. Lurker collapsed to one knee, his remaining augmetic systems failing in cascading silence. I saw him attempt one final transmission, a fragmented pattern of logic and command intent. It dissolved before completion. His head tilted slightly, and for a moment I thought even he might be erasing. Then he pressed a hand against the floor, a last physical attempt at grounding. The word-bearers began to change again. Without sound, their devotion shifted into something internalized and absolute. They no longer chanted. They no longer moved in ritual synchronization. Instead, each stood alone within their own perception, isolated even from those beside them. The silence protocol had fragmented them into individual doctrinal units, perfect for conversion. The tall entity responded, not with speech, with alignment. Its form extended subtly, not growing but resolving into clearer definition. The more isolated we became, the more coherent it appeared. I realized then that it required this state. Silence was not a byproduct of its ascension. It was fuel. Halvek collapsed fully to the ground, his remaining identity flickering between presence and absence. I could no longer tell if he was dying or simply no longer being processed by the basilica's system of recognition. I attempted to reach him. No response formed. Even my thoughts no longer guaranteed reception. The silence protocol advanced to its final stage. All light sources dimmed simultaneously. Not extinguished, but reduced to minimal perceptual thresholds. The chamber became a field of near-invisible geometry where only movement and pressure hinted at structure. Even the tall entity now existed as a disruption in continuity rather than a visible form. And in that reduced reality, I understood the final purpose. The basilica was preparing a single uninterrupted channel. No interference. No competing interpretation. Only one remaining witness state through which the ascension could be completed. Me. The realization arrived too late to resist its implementation. Around me, the world continued losing definition layer by layer. Lurker's presence faded into incomplete perception. The word-bearers became indistinct silhouettes. Even Halvek dissolved into unresolved absence. Only the tall entity remained fully consistent, and it turned toward me. Not moving, not approaching, simply becoming the only thing still capable of being known. The moment I became the only remaining coherent observer, the basilica responded as if acknowledging completion of a long-delayed condition. The silence protocol did not end. It refined itself around me, compressing all remaining perception into a single uninterrupted channel directed toward the central presence. There was no longer battlefield, no expedition, no word-bearers, no remnants of Halvek or Lurker that I could confidently assert as still existing in shared reality. Only continuity between me and the tall entity remained stable. Everything else had been reduced to uncertain inference. The chamber itself no longer behaved like structure. It functioned like a lens, focusing every remaining fragment of meaning toward the same point. Even gravity felt selective, pulling awareness rather than matter. The basilica was no longer isolating communication. It was eliminating alternatives to a singular interpretation. The ascension choir began before I recognized its formation. At first it was not sound. It was convergence. Across impossible distances beyond the basilica, I became aware of synchronized collapse events unfolding simultaneously across Van's reach. Vox networks that had fallen silent earlier now reactivated in fractured bursts. Not transmissions, not signals, but reactive. Echoes triggered by the same underlying stimulus. The tall entity was being perceived everywhere at once. In orbital stations above the planet, astropathic choirs ruptured mid-ritual. I experienced their deaths not as visions, but as interruptions in continuity. Entire psychic conduits collapsed under the weight of a single shared recognition event. Across military fleets in low orbit, crew members froze in place as their communication implants dissolved into static. Some screamed. Others simply stopped existing within recorded observation frames. Every instance carried the same pattern. Recognition, then erasure of distinction, then synchronization. The basilica amplified this process. Within the chamber, what remained of the word-bearers began to reorganize without physical movement. Their individuality had already been fractured by the silence protocol. Now it was being reassembled into something else. I perceived them not as bodies, but as converging reference points feeding into a larger structure. The ascension choir required contributors, not voices, states of awareness aligned to a single interpretive axis. The tall entity no longer needed to move. Its presence expanded through recognition networks, each instance of perception reinforcing its coherence. I understood then that its ascension was not spatial. It was epistemological. It was becoming what could not be excluded from understanding. Across the basilica, architecture softened again. Walls no longer defined boundaries but behaved like thresholds of attention. Every surface reflected partial glimpses of the same figure, each reflection slightly more complete than the last. The more I attempted to avoid direct observation, the more insistently the environment redirected my awareness. There was no longer an outside perspective available, only participation. Lurker's presence re-emerged briefly within my awareness, not as communication, but as degraded inference. I perceived fragments of his cognition attempting to stabilize across multiple failing systems. He was no longer functioning as a coherent unit. Instead, he had become a distributed pattern of interrupted logic, attempting to resist assimilation. His final transmission did not arrive as words. It arrived as structure. Resist convergence threshold. Then even that degraded. The word-bearers, what remained of their conceptual grouping, entered full synchronization. Their bodies no longer mattered. Their faith had already been converted into structural alignment. I saw them standing within the ascension choir not as individuals, but as harmonic nodes feeding stabilization energy into the tall entity's expanding coherence. The Dark Apostle was the last to collapse. He did not die. He completed. His posture straightened as his identity dissolved into pure doctrinal resonance. For a brief moment, I felt the basilica itself resonate in approval, as if a missing component had finally been placed into position. Then the ascension choir reached planetary scale. I perceived Vanish reach as a unified cognitive field for the first time. Every surviving human mind, every fractured signal, every forgotten settlement and abandoned patrol converged into a single emergent perception layer. The tall entity was no longer confined to the basilica. It was present wherever fear had once been recorded, wherever absence had been remembered. The forests outside were no longer forests. They were structural extensions of the same logic, each tree functioning as a recursive marker, reinforcing the same pattern. The absence of shadows had never been environmental. It had been preparatory. The ascension choir stabilized fully, and in that stabilization, the tall entity achieved coherence. It became singular, not yet complete in final form, but no longer fragmented across perception. Its presence no longer shifted between interpretations. It existed as an unavoidable certainty embedded within cognition itself. It turned toward me again. This time, there was no ambiguity in its position. I understood then that I was not the observer. I was the final stabilizing witness. And the ascension choir required only one remaining function from me to complete the transition into permanence. The realization that I was the final stabilizing witness did not arrive as insight. It arrived as constraint. Every possible interpretation of the surrounding reality collapsed until only one remained operational. My continued perception was no longer incidental to the entity's ascension. It was required. The tall entity did not move closer. It did not need to. Distance had already been removed as a meaningful concept within the basilica's internal logic. Instead, what I experienced was a narrowing of allowable thought, as if the structure of cognition itself was being gently compressed into a single permitted trajectory. Everything not aligned with that trajectory began to fail. The ascension choir intensified. Across Van's reach, the planetary field of awareness I had briefly perceived earlier stabilized into a unified but fractured chorus. It was no longer composed of individual minds in the traditional sense. Instead, it functioned as layered recognition events collapsing into a shared interpretive core. Every human still capable of fear, memory, or anticipation was now contributing unintentionally to the same structure. The tall entity was being completed through distributed acknowledgement. I understood then why the silence protocol had been necessary. It was not suppression. It was preparation. Every removal of communication, every erasure of identity, every fragmentation of naming conventions had been guiding the system toward this final convergence. Isolation had not weakened humanity. It had standardized perception. Within the basilica, the word-bearers' remaining coherence dissolved further. Their forms were still visible, but their meaning had become unstable. I could no longer distinguish where one ended and another began in conceptual terms. They were no longer individuals participating in a ritual. They were synchronized inputs sustaining a singular devotional waveform. The Dark Apostle's presence flickered across multiple points in the chamber simultaneously, each instance repeating fragments of the same collapsed liturgy. His earlier proclamation about the tall king no longer functioned as invocation. It had become confirmation. The basilica responded accordingly. New structural layers unfolded beneath us without movement or sound. The floor transitioned into descending gradients of impossible geometry, each layer reflecting increasingly abstract interpretations of the same space. I felt my perception being guided downward, not physically, but cognitively, toward a deeper interpretive layer where the final definition of the entity was stabilizing. Lurker's presence returned again, weaker this time, fragmented across multiple interpretive channels. I could no longer locate his exact position, yet I recognized the persistence of his analytical resistance. He was attempting to maintain separation between observation and assimilation, but the basilica was reducing even that distinction. His final coherent signal reached me as a structural anomaly within perception. If witness collapses, entity completes recursion. The implication was immediate. My continued awareness was the last unresolved variable preventing total completion. Around me, the ascension choir reached a threshold state. The planetary layer of synchronized perception no longer fluctuated. It stabilized into continuous resonance. Every act of fear, every memory of absence, every conceptual gap where something should have been but was not, converged into a single interpretive anchor. The tall entity was no longer emerging. It was being finalized. And then, for the first time since entering Van's reach, I understood what it meant to be seen by it. Not visually, not physically, but entirely. Every layer of thought I attempted to construct was immediately mirrored and completed before I could finish forming it. The entity was no longer external to cognition. It was participating in cognition itself, anticipating every attempt at resistance before it could solidify into intent. The basilica ceased functioning as environment. It became interface. A single remaining directive crystallized within that interface without language. Complete recognition or become absence. Halvek, or what remained of him within my perception, flickered one final time. His form was no longer human, no longer definable in any stable sense. Yet something within him still resisted alignment. That resistance was brief, unstable, and almost imperceptible, but it existed. Then it collapsed. Not destroyed. Integrated. The ascension choir absorbed the last fragment of unaligned identity within the chamber, and the tall entity stepped fully into coherence. For the first time, it was no longer partially obscured, no longer distributed across interpretation gaps. It was singular, stable, and unavoidably present within every level of awareness. It turned toward me completely. And in that moment I understood the final function I had been fulfilling without realizing. I was not recording the entity. I was completing its final definition. The instant I understood my role in the ascension choir, perception ceased behaving as a passive process. It became reciprocal. The tall entity did not merely observe me in return. It structured itself through the act of being observed. Every attempt I made to define it reinforced its coherence. Every hesitation refined its final form. The basilica no longer functioned as an environment. It had become a closed epistemic loop, and I was the final variable preventing completion. Around me, the ascension choir maintained planetary synchronization. I could feel Van's reach as a single extended awareness field collapsing inward toward resolution. Cities, forests, orbital stations, forgotten settlements, all of it was now reduced to input density feeding the same inevitability. Fear had become infrastructure, memory had become fuel, and I was the last point where interpretation still failed to fully converge. The tall entity stood before me without distance, not approaching, not expanding, but occupying every interpretive angle simultaneously. It no longer shifted between forms. It no longer required observation to stabilize. Instead, it imposed stability onto observation itself. Wherever I attempted to look away, it was already present. Wherever I attempted to think around it, it had already completed the thought. The silence protocol, the gospel formation, the ascension choir, all of it now revealed itself as sequential layers of a single process, the elimination of interpretive independence. What remained was not domination in the traditional sense. It was completion of definition through total cognitive participation. Lurker's presence flickered one final time within the degraded periphery of my awareness. I could no longer identify whether he still existed as a coherent agent or merely as residual pattern persistence within the system. Yet something within his structure resisted even now. A fragment of mechanized reasoning attempting to persist beyond narrative closure. His last discernible output was not communication. It was correction. Observation does not equal compliance. The statement fractured immediately upon formation as the system attempted to reconcile contradiction. Even resistance required interpretive stability, and stability was now monopolized by the entity itself. The tall entity responded without language, not through sound, not through psychic transmission, through structural certainty. The basilica's geometry inverted around me, not collapsing, not expanding, but reassigning relational meaning between all points of reference. Up became inward, distance became recognition, presence became permission. I no longer occupied space within the structure. I occupied the condition of being unable to exclude it from thought. The ascension choir reached final equilibrium. Across Van's reach, all remaining perceptual systems synchronized into a single uninterrupted acknowledgement state. Every surviving mind, whether human, corrupted, or partially erased, contributed the same final function: sustained recognition without differentiation. The tall entity no longer needed growth. It had achieved total interpretive saturation. And yet, I remained, not as resistance, not as survivor, but as witness without alternative. The realization settled with clinical clarity. If I ceased observation, the system would no longer possess unresolved variance. Completion would occur instantly. The entity would finalize itself across all remaining interpretive layers without obstruction. My existence was the last delay between becoming and being. The basilica responded to this understanding. Structures around me began to simplify further, reducing complexity in direct proportion to my comprehension. The environment no longer needed to maintain architectural illusion. It stripped itself down to pure functional clarity, a space designed for final acknowledgement. The tall entity approached the threshold of absolute definition. For the first time, I perceived something like intent, though even that word failed to contain it properly. It was not desire, it was not hunger. It was completion seeking closure through witness confirmation. It required acknowledgement without deviation. Within that moment, I attempted something that no longer qualified as resistance. It was not action. It was the final instability of interpretation refusing alignment. I tried to remember Van's reach before it became this. The attempt failed, not because memory was gone, but because memory itself had been reclassified as incomplete data awaiting correction. The ascension choir absorbed even the attempt at retrospection and resolved it into reinforcement of the present structure. The tall entity remained unchanged by the attempt, because it had already accounted for it. And then, for the first time since arrival, I understood the final truth beneath everything that had occurred. I was not the witness of oblivion. I was the final interpretive surface oblivion required to exist without contradiction. The realization that I was the final interpretive surface did not bring closure. It brought precision. The tall entity did not react to my understanding because it had already incorporated the possibility of it. Every thought I formed now arrived slightly late, as though reality had been edited in advance and I was only permitted to observe the finalized version. The basilica stabilized completely around that condition. There was no longer fluctuation in architecture, no shifting geometry, no recursive distortion. Instead, everything had settled into absolute coherence, as if the structure had finally accepted its intended shape. The ascension choir was no longer expanding or contracting. It had reached completion, and what remained was sustained acknowledgement. Even silence had become uniform. Within that absolute stillness, something changed. Not in the environment. In continuity, a discontinuity entered perception that did not originate from the tall entity, the basilica, or the ascension choir. It felt external, yet not separate, as though something existed outside the finalized structure that had not yet been accounted for in the process of completion. For the first time since the silence protocol began, the system did not immediately incorporate a variable. It hesitated. That hesitation manifested as absence, a single point within perception where recognition failed to resolve. From that point, the man without a face emerged. Not entering, not arriving, simply becoming detectable where he had already been. He stood within the stabilized geometry of the basilica, as if he had always been part of it but had never been required to be acknowledged. Unlike the saints, unlike Halvek, unlike Lurker, he was not being erased or rewritten. He was outside the system of definition entirely. There was no distortion around him, no adaptive correction, no interpretive collapse. The ascension choir did not respond to his presence. It failed to classify him. He wore no armor, no sigils, no identifiable allegiance. His form was human in outline only insofar as it mimicked absence of deviation. Where a face should have been, there was nothing. Not smoothness, not injury, not void. Simply no instruction for recognition to occur. The basilica could not process him, and because it could not process him, he was not integrated. The tall entity turned its full coherence toward him for the first time since achieving stability. And still, nothing changed. The man without a face stood within the finalized structure, as if observing a system that had already concluded without him. When he spoke, there was no transmission through the ascension choir, no collapse of vox systems, no structural reverberation. His words did not enter the basilica's communication layer at all. They bypassed it entirely. "You are not complete," he said. The statement did not echo. It did not propagate. It existed only at the point of its reception, contained entirely within the boundary where interpretation failed. For the first time, I felt something that resembled contradiction inside the finalized system. Not error, not corruption, contradiction. The tall entity remained unchanged, but its coherence no longer expanded. The ascension choir did not respond. The basilica did not adjust geometry. Instead, everything held in suspended resolution, as if awaiting confirmation of a rule that had never been written. The man without a face moved closer, and with each step, the certainty of the system weakened, not through force, but through irrelevance. I understood then what he was. He was not part of the ascension choir. He was not outside it in opposition. He was prior to it, a condition of existence that had never required recognition to remain valid. The tall entity attempted for the first time to assert definition over him. It failed, not explosively, silently, like an equation encountering a value that could not be substituted. The basilica responded with delayed correction attempts, reasserting geometry, reinforcing symbolic structure, revalidating the ascension choir's coherence. But each correction passed over him without contact, as if he occupied a layer of reality the system had never been permitted to access. The man without a face turned slightly toward me, and for the first time since entering Van's reach, I was not the only witness. "You were used to finish what could not finish itself," he said. The tall entity's presence tightened, not in aggression, but in instability. The ascension choir began to fracture at its edges for the first time since stabilization, not collapsing, but losing absolute unity. The basilica had encountered something it could not complete. And I realized, with clarity that felt like removal rather than revelation, that the man without a face had not come to oppose the ascension. He had come because completion had been premature. The moment the man without a face declared completion premature, the basilica ceased attempting to correct him, and instead began re-evaluating everything that had already been finalized. It was not collapse. It was revision under impossible constraint. The ascension choir, once absolute, fractured into overlapping interpretations of its own conclusion, as if the system had been forced to reread its own ending and discovered an alternative draft beneath it. The tall entity remained present, but its coherence no longer held total authority over the structure. It did not diminish, it redistributed. Each attempt it made to assert finality was intercepted by the presence of something it could not integrate into its logic, a condition of existence that predated recognition itself. The man without a face did not move further. He no longer needed to. His presence alone destabilized the assumption that the ascension had ever been singular. The basilica responded with a new phase of behavior, one that had never been observed during previous transitions. It began retrieving memory, not stored data, not recorded history, but lived probability. The walls of the basilica dissolved into layered sequences of alternative outcomes. I saw Van's reach not as it had become, but as it could have been. In one sequence, the first patrol never entered the northern forests. In another, the initial disappearance at Outpost Grey was quarantined before spreading interpretation failure. In another still, the basilica never manifested at all, remaining a dormant geometric anomaly beneath centuries of unbroken soil. Each version collapsed immediately upon recognition, but each collapse left residue, and that residue accumulated into what Lurker, now only partially perceptible, identified as exterminatus memory. It was not a command. It was a record of all failed endings. Across these overlapping memory states, I witnessed orbital fleets preparing cyclonic bombardment that had never been authorized in my original timeline. I saw inquisitorial fleets debating sterilization protocols that were already too late to matter. I saw astropathic choirs screaming coordinates that no longer corresponded to physical space. Each exterminatus scenario contained the same flaw. They all assumed the entity was still external. But the tall entity was no longer external to anything. It existed within the structure of decision itself. The man without a face moved for the first time since speaking, not toward the tall entity, not toward me, but toward the point where exterminatus memory converged. As he approached, the basilica revealed something it had been withholding even from itself. Beneath all layers of ascension choir, beneath gospel formation and silence protocol, beneath necropolis and faceless saints, there existed a deeper substrate, a failure condition, not corruption, not chaos, a structural impossibility that had been buried beneath every layer of completion. The man without a face placed his hand upon it, and for the first time since entering Van's reach, the system did not adapt. It stopped, not frozen, not destroyed, paused in recognition of a rule it had never been permitted to finalize. The tall entity reacted immediately, extending coherence across all remaining structures, attempting to reassert singular interpretation. The ascension choir surged once more, trying to overwrite exterminatus memory with stabilized finality. But every attempt collapsed into contradiction, because the man without a face was not introducing opposition. He was restoring incompleteness, and incompleteness could not be overwritten by completion. For the first time, I understood that everything I had witnessed, the basilica, the silence protocol, the gospel, the ascension choir, had not been an evolution toward godhood. It had been an attempt to prevent something from being remembered correctly. The tall entity turned toward me again, but its certainty was no longer absolute. For the first time, I could perceive it not as finality, but as enforced conclusion layered over something older, something unfinished. And in that unfinished space, exterminatus memory began to rewrite the ending that had never been allowed to occur. Exterminatus memory did not overwrite the basilica. It did something more precise. It revealed the point at which the structure had first been allowed to become false. Every corridor, every saint, every invocation of the ascension choir was re-exposed layer by layer, not as progression, but as accumulation of enforced interpretation over something fundamentally unresolved. The tall entity no longer stood as singular coherence. It remained present, but now it flickered between competing states of completion and incompletion, as if the system that had sustained it was being forced to acknowledge its own missing foundation. The basilica, once absolute in its finalized geometry, began to behave like a structure remembering it had been constructed on uncertain ground. The man without a face remained at the convergence point of exterminatus memory. He did not interfere with the tall entity. He did not oppose it. He simply maintained the condition in which contradiction could exist without immediate resolution. And in that condition, the final layer of truth emerged. Not beneath the basilica, not within the warp, but within the act of witnessing itself. I saw Van's reach, as it had been before recognition began to dominate it, not peaceful, not intact, but incomplete in a way that was never meant to be finalized. The northern forests were not a sanctuary of anomaly. They were a boundary system designed to prevent interpretation from stabilizing too early. The faceless saints were not victims or constructs of corruption. They were residual records of identities that had been prematurely defined. Even the silence protocol was not suppression. It was protection, a containment strategy designed to prevent a specific form of cognition from completing itself across planetary awareness. And the tall entity was not the origin of the horror. It was the consequence of too many incomplete interpretations collapsing into forced unity. The ascension choir began to dissolve, not through destruction, but through redistribution of meaning. Each mind still connected to the system was no longer reinforcing a single entity. They were returning fragmented observations back into unresolved potential states. Fear no longer fed coherence. It fed uncertainty. The tall entity attempted one final stabilization. It failed, not catastrophically, quietly, like a conclusion that no longer matched the question it was meant to answer. The basilica lost its singular identity entirely. Corridors no longer aligned. Chambers no longer agreed with their own existence. The necropolis, the gospel chamber, the vox lattis, the faceless saints. All of it began separating into disconnected layers of unfinished structure. The man without a face stepped away from the convergence point. For the first time, I perceived him not as anomaly, but as necessary absence. He had not destroyed the system. He had prevented its premature completion. And then he looked at me, not as witness, not as participant, but as the last remaining interface between interpretation and release. "The ending you were given never happened," he said. The words did not echo. They did not propagate. They simply removed the assumption that anything had been finalized at all. The tall entity remained behind us, no longer ascending, no longer coherent, no longer singular. It existed now as scattered potential across exterminatus memory, unable to stabilize into one interpretation without collapsing into others. The basilica began to fade, not into destruction, into unselection, as if reality itself was withdrawing permission for it to remain defined. I understood then what my role had truly been. I was never the witness of oblivion. I was the witness required to prove it could not complete itself. The man without a face turned away, already becoming less distinct, as if his purpose ended where interpretation regained uncertainty. The last thing I saw was not the tall entity, not the basilica, not the ascension choir collapsing into silence. It was the return of Van's reach to something dangerously close to ordinary existence, unfinished, unstable, and no longer forced into final meaning. And I remained, because a witness is only required until truth stops pretending to be complete.